Hello and welcome to the lecture for Module 7. Module 7 is a shorter module. I'm sure you will appreciate that because I really want you to start studying for the midterm exam. So Module 7 is a little bit of a lighter load. So Module 7 is about the treatment for victims of domestic violence and prevention methods for preventing domestic violence either from getting worse or from occurring at all. I'm going to look at a couple of different things here. One is different types of psychological help that victims of domestic violence can receive. Now, certainly we cannot cover anything like all the different types of mental health services and forms of therapy that a survivor of domestic violence could use. That's just a little beyond the scope of this class. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight a couple forms of therapy that are currently in use and have found to be effective for victims of domestic violence. Then we're going to move on to some services that are available in our communities that you need to be aware of. And then we're going to talk about prevention, both on an individual level and on a larger, national approach. So one of the first types of therapy we can talk about is cognitive behavioral therapy, what is often referred to as CBT. Now, this is a traditional form of what they call talk therapy or psychotherapy. This involves a victim of domestic violence talking through issues with a trained therapist. And what the therapist does is helps the client become aware of inaccurate or negative thinking that they fall back on so they can look at challenging situations that come up in their life more clearly and find a more effective way to respond to those situations. So just like the title suggests, cognitive behavioral, that means working with your mind to change behavior. A lot of people can use this type of therapy. Mental health counselors, therapists, psychologists, social workers, many people in the mental health field use cognitive behavioral therapy. It can be done in an individual session, which would be just the client and the therapist. It can also be done as a form of group therapy, where there would be many clients in one room working together with a therapist. And CBT has been researched to be very effective for addressing problems related to domestic violence, such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. We've talked a lot this semester about domestic violence isn't just a straightforward, easy issue to resolve, right? A lot of victims of domestic violence have other very serious issues to contend with, including post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. So that's why cognitive behavioral therapy is often put forward as an option for people who have suffered from domestic violence, because not only can it help survivors deal with issues directly related to domestic violence, it can also help with issues associated with domestic violence, such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. This may be a type of therapy you've heard of, maybe not. STAIR, the acronym STAIR, is an acronym for Skills Training in Affective and Interpersonal Regulation. That's quite a mouthful, right? Notice the term affective. It's not effective. Affect is like your emotional state. So if you said someone had a flat affect, you would be referring to someone who doesn't display a lot of emotion. So this is Skills Training in Affective and Interpersonal Regulation, acronym STAIR. This is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. So STAIR could be considered a subset of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the focus with the skills training is reframing cognitions, which is just a fancy word for your thoughts, reframing thoughts that have emerged as a result of a traumatic experience. So while cognitive behavioral therapy can be helpful to all kinds of people working on different issues that may or may not be related to traumatic experiences, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy is very helpful in helping people just deal with the daily stresses of life. where the skills training in affective and interpersonal regulation specifically is looking to help manage traumatic experiences, such as those experiences faced by victims of domestic violence. Psychoeducation, that's just mind education about the impact of trauma on emotions and relationships. So again, really focusing on helping the client understand how trauma impacts victims on an emotional level and how having suffered trauma impacts their relationships with people. Not only just their relationships with the abusive person, but their relationships, how they're impacted with siblings, with children, with coworkers. Emotion regulation skills, again, is helping a victim regulate their emotions so that their emotional response is in proportion to whatever's occurring in their life. I'm sure you've heard the expression flight, fright, flight, fight, or freeze. Sorry about that. Those are three common responses to traumatic situations. Some people fight back aggressively, some people run or flee, and some people freeze. So emotion regulation skills would help a person to work through an experience they are facing, and instead of reliving the traumatic experience, to learn how to respond to the situation that's right in front of them in a manner that's proportionate to what's going on. It also helps clients work on the effective expression of negative emotions. Oftentimes, victims of domestic violence fear ever really expressing themselves. They fear expressing anger for concern that that is going to bring a violent response for their abuser. They may be afraid to express that they're sad or that they're feeling depressed because that's going to make their abuser trigger them into some sort of violent action against them. Or it's going to trigger verbal abuse. Oh, you're always feeling sorry for yourself. You're always so depressed. You never want to do anything, right? So for fear of either their emotional states triggering violence, but they're also just afraid to express their emotional states because maybe they've been mocked, or maybe their feelings have been totally invalidated by their abusive partner. So the effective expression of negative emotions helps a victim of domestic violence learn, look, these are normal emotions you're experiencing, and it's perfectly acceptable and encouraged for you to experience those emotions in a healthy way. Whether you're by yourself, you're with your children, you're with an intimate partner, or you're at work. And lastly, the skills training works on interpersonal skills related to appropriate assertiveness. Again, we've known from our earlier studies that victims of domestic violence can also be abused into the point where they're almost frozen with inaction. They're afraid to speak out for themselves. They're afraid to assert themselves, even in a very appropriate and professional way. So these skills training focus on that it's okay to express what you need. It is okay to express what you want, and that you need to do that in order to have healthy relationships. And this form of therapy actually gives victims skills so they can learn how to express their own needs with the right level of assertiveness so they can hopefully get what they want out of the relationships they're in. Cognitive processing therapy sounds like CBT, but it's different. And again, cognitive processing therapy is not only good for the normal stressors of life, it's also researched to be a very effective treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and depression that's specifically related to having been victimized, either physically or sexually. So again, that's why this therapy is often specifically mentioned for those who've survived domestic violence. And cognitive processing therapy focuses on educating the client about post-traumatic stress disorder, what it is, what causes it. You can imagine how frightening it would be to literally feel like you're reliving an experience that happened to you a year ago or 5 years ago, where all of a sudden something triggers you. Maybe it's a smell or a sound, and you actually feel like you're re-experiencing trauma that was inflicted upon you a year or 5 years or more ago. So cognitive processing therapy allows the therapist to really help the client understand what post-traumatic stress disorder is. For example, you're not crazy if when you heard that loud bang, you felt like you were about to be hit, and explain why that occurs. It also focuses on the connections between trauma-related thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And unlike other forms of therapy, cognitive processing therapy actually helps a client remember traumatic events. It's encouraged while in the therapeutic environment that the client actually does feel the trauma that they experienced in the past, so the therapist can help them work through those feelings. And it's also about learning reducing the negative thinking patterns that people with severe mental health issues, especially victims of domestic violence, suffer. So a negative thinking pattern would be, I'm a horrible person and I don't deserve to be with somebody who treats me nice. Or I'm ugly and no one's ever going to love me. Or that person may have abused me, but now that I've lost them, I'll never find someone to love me again. And what does that sound like? That sounds like all the language and verbal abuse the abuser has heaped upon this person, right? So they've now adopted some of those thoughts and thinking patterns as their own. I'm not worth anything. I don't deserve someone to treat me nicely, right? So a therapist trained in cognitive processing therapy can help a client recognize that they have those thought patterns and help them learn how to stop those patterns and develop new, healthier ways of thinking. Now, this is a complete movement away from talk therapy, right? Remember, when we talk about talk therapy, we're talking about a client and a therapist talking and verbally working through issues. EMDR is a very different thing, and I really encourage you to learn more about this form of therapy. It's relatively new compared to like talk therapy has been around for hundreds of years. EMDR is very new, and what it stands for is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's a mouthful, which is why everybody calls it EMDR. EMDR is not talk therapy. It's not about a client spending a lot of time explaining in detail their past experiences and how they felt about them, and having the therapist help them understand how what's occurred in the past is affecting them now. That's not what EMDR is about. EMDR is a multi-step process of identifying traumatic experiences, and then the client is actually in an office with a therapist and recalls these traumatic events, and actually, to the best of their ability, tries to re-experience what they were feeling, what they were thinking, what they saw during those traumatic events. And with the help of the therapist manipulating the motion of their eyes, they actually help the client reprogram those memories. And I'll give you a quick example. So a victim of a rape several years ago, when in feeling vulnerable or put in a vulnerable situation, may not only feel as if they're going to be raped again, but they feel that immediate fear and terror that they felt during the original event, even though there's nothing really scary or there's no actual real threat in front of them. It's triggering these past emotions that are now wired into the brain due to this previous trauma. And by working on this multi-step process with the therapist and then re-experiencing that trauma in the therapist's presence, the therapist actually helps reprocess, or another way to think of it is reprogram those memories. So when that victim of a rape is now in a situation that's frightening, it doesn't trigger all those old traumatic memories. It's a really fascinating therapy. I strongly encourage you to learn more about this. Okay, moving on to a different topic. We know without a whole lot of discussion that victims of domestic violence need a lot of services. We can kind of group them into three categories. One being legal. Of course, they need assistance with obtaining orders of protection. We learned how complicated that can be to even figure out which is the correct court, what those orders mean, the different types of orders. They're going to need help with court appearances if that's relevant to their case. They may have to be a witness. They may have to provide testimony in front of their abuser in court, and they're certainly going to need help with that. Many victims of domestic violence need immediate help with housing, whether to obtain housing because they've lost the housing they had, or maybe now they maintain the housing they were in and the abuser leaves, but they may not be able to financially afford that place on their own. And of course, there's safety measures involved with housing, for example, things like lock changes, which we'll talk about in a second. And lastly, of course, these victims need mental health assistance. They need actual treatment, and then they need help with safety planning. So let's just look at a couple of those quickly. For example, we have the Albany County Crime Victim and Sexual Violence Center located, well, guess what? In Albany, right? So this is one of our primary local agencies that helps victims of domestic violence. And here's some of the services they offer. They can help someone get an order of protection. That's really helpful in figuring out the correct court to go to, how to fill out the application, how to get the order, explaining the order will have to be served before it's effective, all those things we talked about in the previous module. Safety planning is very important for people who've left abusive relationships. This helps a person come up with a concrete plan about what they're going to do if certain things occur. For example, if the victim is leaving work and walking toward their car and their abuser appears, what exactly are they going to do? Are they going to call 911? That's great. Do they have a cell phone to call 911? Maybe it's wearing an alert. Maybe it's creating a plan with friends or family members who will consistently check in on the person and make sure they're okay. Transportation to and from court and meetings with the district attorney's office. We've talked about oftentimes victims of domestic violence don't leave a relationship with the vehicle, right? So they may need help with just basic transportation. Lock changes. There's an important housing issue. If an abusive person is removed from a home, there's nothing to prevent them from returning. So oftentimes locks need to be changed, other safety measures need to be put into place so a person can maintain safe housing. They may need assistance completing applications to the New York State Office of Victim Services. You're going to learn more about that office and the services they provide in the media section of this module. It also assists with victim impact statements. We didn't get an opportunity to really have an in-depth look at court proceedings, criminal court proceedings, once those begin involving domestic violence. Victim impact statements, of course, is the victim's opportunity at the end of a trial to express to the judge and or jury how the crime has impacted their life. So the Albany County Center can help them with those victim impact statements. They can also educate people about the VINE notification system. We'll talk about that in just a second. And the center often offers short-term confidential counseling, emphasis being here on short-term. So what is VINE? VINE stands for Victim Information and Notification Every Day. Kind of a silly term, but that's actually what VINE stands for. And what the VINE system is, it's a notification system for crime victims, not just victims of domestic violence, but people who've been victimized by all sorts of criminal activity. So what happens here is a crime victim registers with the VINE system, and it can be kind of a multi-step process, which is nice why the Albany County Center helps people do this. And what it does is if their criminal offender is released from a facility, if they abscond, meaning they take off from a facility, or if they're paroled from a correctional facility, the VINE notification system immediately notifies the victim that the person has been released and is back in the community. Of course, that's really important for victims to be able to ensure their own safety. If they think their abuser's locked up in jail and they go back about their lives and then they find out when their abuser shows up at their job that they've been released, that creates a really dangerous situation. So if a crime victim is able to register with the Vine system, they will get immediate notifications if their offender has been released from a facility. And the system also allows victims to obtain information by phone and by internet. So we're going to talk just very briefly about domestic violence prevention. This is a topic that we should probably spend a lot more time on. Unfortunately, a 15-week semester doesn't really afford us that opportunity. So this is just going to be more of an introduction or a food for thought on ways we can prevent domestic violence. And first, we're going to focus on how individual people can prevent domestic violence. So there's a great website online, domesticshelters.org, and they publish 10 ways individuals can help prevent domestic violence. The first is to know the warning signs, right? Not only for your friends, family members, and coworkers, so you can know if they're in a potentially domestic violence situation, but also for ourselves, right? Because early recognition is key here. If you start dating someone and they start showing signs, possessiveness, jealousy, verbal abuse, if you know that those are actually warning signs for domestic violence, it may help you get out of a relationship sooner rather than later. So knowing the warning signs both for your own self and for your friends, family members, and coworkers. Their second tip is don't ignore it. A lot of times we think, well, I don't want to get involved. That's somebody else's personal business. It's really not my affair to talk to them about their business. That's absolutely not recommended that we ignore domestic violence where we know it's occurring or where we even suspect it's occurring. A great thing you can do is to be a non-judgmental ally. That just means that you're somebody safe that somebody can talk to, that they know that they can talk to you about their fears or their concerns in their relationship, and that you're not going to judge them or criticize them, but you'll just be a non-judgmental friend who can listen to them. Oftentimes that is super helpful for people who are struggling in relationships. Number 4 is to be available. Right? That just means that you're available. If somebody needs help, if somebody needs a ride, that you could be available for them. It's also extremely helpful if you know the contact information for help. Like, for example, you know how to contact your local DV shelter or other services that are available in your community. If you have the incredible opportunity of having someone reach out to you for help, you're going to want to be able to help them quickly. It may be the only time they ask, and you may only get one shot. So you certainly don't want to have to say to them, well, let me do some research online and I'll get back to you, right? You're going to want to be able to help them with resources very quickly. Number 6 is check in regularly. A lot of times it can be really helpful for somebody in an abusive or very difficult relationship to just have somebody check in and make sure they're okay. Of course, you can be a resource. That could mean something like keeping copies of somebody's important documentation, that you have a Xerox copy of their driver's license, their birth certificate, their passport, or any other important information. So if they try to leave the relationship and they cannot obtain all those really important documents, that you would have a copy in your home that you would keep for them. They also suggest that we write it down. Well, write what down? That means you write down what someone in a domestic violence relationship is telling you. So if they're telling you that there was a particularly bad fight on Tuesday, October 2nd, that you jot that down in a notebook and you keep track of that. It is incredibly hard for people in violent relationships to document things that are going on, and oftentimes it's unsafe for them to do so. It's probably not going to help their situation if their abuser finds a detailed diary listing all the violence that's been inflicted upon them. However, if you could keep that safely in your home, that could be really helpful later on. Another way you can prevent domestic violence is to raise awareness, right? The more we know, the more we can help other people. So for example, it's really helpful if when talking about these issues with other people, if they have misconceptions about domestic violence, like, well, that only happens to poor people, or that only happens to young people, that you can help dispel some of those myths. And their 10th way was that you refuse to spend your money on any industry, game, movie, or any other item that glorifies violence against intimate partners. It is a very strong thing you can do is to speak with your pocketbook. And we'll just talk briefly about, we know how we can maybe prevent domestic violence or bring awareness to it individually. Well, how do we do it nationally or even globally? So there's a few things we can do. One, of course, is to create prevention programs. Now that's really easy to say, right? Well, create a prevention program, but it's more than that. It means figuring out what programs work and giving them adequate funding. And how do you figure out if they work? Well, you have to evaluate their effectiveness objectively. How many people are they serving? How many people have they helped, right? Share data and resources. So different prevention programs should be sharing data and resources with each other. And here's an important one I don't hear people mention too often. If there's a poorly performing prevention program, get rid of it, disband it. Don't pour money into programs that don't work. Of course, we need to educate our children on being respectful and kind human beings. Children need to be taught from a very young age, both at home and at school, how to treat each other with respect and dignity. We need to spend more time educating teens on the signs of domestic violence. We oftentimes think that domestic violence only happens to quote unquote adults. There is a lot of very disturbing research about the incidence and extent of domestic violence going on in teenagers' dating lives. And of course, as I said a moment ago, to help break down misconceptions about domestic violence. So our first method is creating prevention programs. Our second is that the penalties for domestic violence must be firm, and they also must be consistent. Note that's an and, firm and consistent. Research shows that mandatory arrest of the primary aggressor has proven to be very effective. Oftentimes, abusive people are not impacted by family and friends telling them they need to act differently, family and friends disassociating from them. Oftentimes, that has no impact. But getting arrested and going to jail oftentimes has a very serious impact on an abusive person. Now, can it also inflame their anger? Absolutely. That's also a warning thing we need to look for. But research suggests that mandatory arrest of primary aggressors actually reduces acts of domestic violence. So while they may not be afraid of their partner or their partner's friends or family members, abusers are often afraid of the police and actually going to jail. Punishment for acts of domestic violence must be serious. This is not violation, pay a $25 ticket level offenses. Punishment for violating orders of protections must be certain and severe. No one's going to follow an order of protection if they don't think there's any chance of them getting arrested or going to jail for violating the order. And we need to increase training for our judges, our attorneys, and law enforcement about domestic violence and how to work with victims. The third way to prevent domestic violence nationally or globally is to increase funding for support services. So we know we need to fund educational services, but we also need to fund support services. So we've talked about all the challenges victims face in trying to leave a relationship. And they're going to need support that could include free or low-cost mental health services, housing assistance, legal assistance, safe shelters, long-term support. It's often easier to find short-term support, but we know many victims are going to need long-term support, and they often need help with childcare. So there's some really important services that needed to be funded. that can help that transition, help a person transition from a violent relationship to an independent life. And it's not going to happen quickly. And lastly, a really important way to help prevent domestic violence is to help women become financially independent. We, even in 2020, still have huge gaps in pay equality between men and women, and we still have a lot of women who don't have the education or training they need to be entirely financially independent, whether they have children or they don't. So higher education, relevant training, and licensure. By licensure, I mean licenses that can help you get a job, a relatively well-paying job, such as a nursing license, a license to practice social work. We know that financial instability is one of the primary reasons women cite for being unable to leave. And I don't mean to suggest that if you give a person money, that solves all their problems, right? We know that's not true. But economic resources does equal having more options. If you have to move into a shelter to leave a relationship, you might be more reluctant to leave that relationship. But if you know you can afford your own apartment if you leave, that might make it that much easier to make that transition. So I don't suggest that financial resources solve all problems, but they do allow you to have more options. So just a couple of quick midterm exam reminders. Our midterm exam will open on Thursday, October 22nd at 8 a.m. and the exam closes the following day, Friday, October 23rd at 11:59 p.m. You may take the exam at any point between Thursday morning and Friday night. Please do not wait to the last minute. You do not want to open the exam at 11:30 Friday night and find out it's going to take you 2 hours to take the exam, because that exam will automatically close at midnight. So please ensure that you have at least 2 hours to take the exam so you can relax and really give it your best effort. The exam is only taken one time. This is not like our quizzes. You get one shot at the exam, and it is really important that you study, because your exam score is 25% of your course grade. That is a very large proportion of your course grade, so you really do want to study for the midterm. Here's another reminder. I put this note out in the announcement a couple of times already, but please remember that all course material, the lectures, article, media, everything, is going to disappear from view on October 22nd at 8 a.m. when the exam opens. So you don't have to take the exam Thursday morning. But if you want to study Thursday night, the only thing you're going to have access to is your textbook. So I tell you that now so you can plan accordingly. And before the exam, I'm going to give you a list of covered topics, and I'm going to give you some study suggestions. So the midterm exam is Module 8. So you'll take the midterm between Thursday and Friday, and that following Tuesday, October 27th, Module 9 will open. So that's it for the Module 7 lecture, and you just have a couple of items to complete to finish Module 7. One is in the article, you'll see the report that was issued at the end of May from Governor Cuomo's COVID-19 Domestic Violence Task Force. That task force issued a report in May about what they discovered about domestic violence in relation to the restrictions imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's one of your assignments, is to read the task force report. I think it's 7 pages long. Then in the media, I wrote you a very short 1-page summary of a local murder that occurred last week that you may have heard about. And I would like you to learn just a little bit about the basics of that case, because it did involve domestic violence that resulted in a homicide in our community about a week ago. In the media section, you're also going to have a link to the New York State Office of Victim Services. That link's going to take you to a 2-page brochure. I just want you to look through that brochure and familiarize yourself with some of the services that this agency offers. They help victims of all types of crimes, including domestic violence. And lastly, your quiz for Module 7 will open Friday at 8 a.m. You do not have a project this week. Thank you so much for listening. Of course, if you have any questions or need any assistance, please let me know.